Many thanks, Claire. Good morning, everybody, to our virtual ADHD conference. As Claire said, my name's Chris Williams. I'm a regional director with the Witherslack group. And the role I have is to work with our schools, supporting the head teachers and the staff to help them with whatever they need to get the best outcomes for our young people. In addition to that, what I've also done over the last few years is I've actually stood in as head teacher in a number of our settings. So I've got first-hand recent experience of working in our settings, obviously with staff and parents and young people. Added to that, I've got experience of working in senior leadership in special schools in a variety of forms over approximately 20 years now, and that includes everything from young people with very complex needs to young people with autism, to young people with ADHD. So what I really want to do this morning is talk initially, in a sense, to parents and carers about how they can work with the schools to support that successful relationship, to make sure that the school is in the best position to get the best outcomes for the young person. And then obviously, in terms of meeting their full potential, the more the school has, if you like, a toolkit to make sure that they've got everything they can to achieve the best outcomes, the more likely those outcomes are to be achieved. So in a sense, what I really want to do this morning is encourage parents and carers to work in a variety of ways with their schools, to better equip the schools, as we said, to achieving the right kind of outcomes for the young people. But as I'm also talking to professionals in that sense, because what I want to make sure is professionals are clear about the role they can play in supporting the parents and carers to do that. Because let's be honest, it's difficult for anybody, and I'm a parent myself, whether you got the doctors, whether you got the dentist or schools, when you're dealing with professional people, sometimes you think, there's sort of a kind of language that's used, there's things that are talked about, and it'd be difficult on either side for real understanding of actually the best way to work. And sometimes you've been working with a young person for a long time, and I've got personal experience of this, and then some piece of information will come to light that you think, if we'd known that previously, and in many ways it was our responsibility to try and get that information. So I think, yes, I'm talking to parents and carers, but yes, I want to be able to talk to professionals as well to make sure they understand about how to present in a way that makes it as easy as possible, if you like, for the parents and carers to work with them. So a number of areas I'm wanted to look at today is obviously why the relationship matters, and in many ways people are probably going to be thinking, well, actually we know why that relationship matters, but there's a couple of key points I want to cover there just to reinforce and re-emphasize, if you like, why that relationship is so important in terms of the speed and effectiveness which things can be implemented, the better that working relationship is. Also then to talk about your child and their education, in terms of the fact that on the whole the parents and the carers really are the expert here, and in a way what I'm trying to do is to perhaps flip people's thinking on its head, because like I've said before, as a parent myself, and all of us, when we liaise with professionals, we always assume that they are the expert in their field, and of course they are, and we get that. But actually, when it comes to working with young people, I would argue that the best people to really judge initially about what's best for that young person are the parents and carers who've grown up with that young person, who look after them 24 hours a day. And obviously then that needs a dialogue with the professional, with the professionals in the school about the best ways of how those things can be implemented, or information can be implemented for the child. But actually, there's a lot of information as the expert 24 hours a day looking after the young person that the parent and carer can bring to the table. And then equally, as I've said, in terms of also talking to professionals and carers, there's a part there about what parents and carers should expect from the professionals in the setting, in terms of how that relationship should be managed by the school, and what that information flow back should be, because obviously it goes without saying this is a two-way process. And that's why that the next point really, and the last point I wanted to make, is what you can do as the parent and carer then to help that, to make sure that it is a two-way process. And I'm going to be very honest about it. I'm going to make the point that it's a, at times it can be a bumpy road, because there's a lot of information that needs to be relayed, particularly when you're working with young people with a complex level of need. And in doing so, it's for parents and carers, family members, whoever it is working and living with that young person on a daily basis, to understand that they still have the right to, if you like, for want of a better expression, to push back on things that they're told about the best things to do in the school setting. So really, it's about recognizing a two-way process with the parents and the carers at the heart of it, in terms of being the experts. But and at times, yes, even when it gets difficult, the things that we can all do to maintain that relationship on both sides, to make sure ultimately we get back to what I talked about at the beginning, which is making sure we get the best outcomes for the young person. So obviously, why the relationship matters, simple as that, positive outcomes for the young person. Can't emphasize enough, and again, it's a statement of the obvious, but I can't emphasize enough how much more likely it is to get positive outcomes for that young person when everybody is working together. Now, the point I want to make here is, when we're talking about positive outcomes for young people and the flow of information between home and school, people always tend to look in the very short and medium term, because that's what we do. Because we're looking at what's in front of us, what have we got to do today, what have we got to do tomorrow, what have we got to do next week. But one of the things I want people to think about today is actually, from the start and the point where your young person moves into a setting and is working with a group of staff, and working with a group of staff over a period of time, is the extent to which the school and the setting understand over the longer term what it is you want and your child wants. So we're not just talking about the short term in terms of, what have we got to do today? What have we got to do next week? What is it you want long term for your child? And what does your child want long term in terms of what will be the best outcome for them? And I would argue there's nothing wrong with talking about those longer term goals in terms of what you want your child to be able to leave school and able to do very quickly in kind of early on in terms of that working relationship with the school, because then they can start to look and put things that they do in the context of what that bigger picture is. Too often in my experience, the bigger picture gets forgotten because we're dealing with the here and now. We're dealing with these issues, the issues that come up today and tomorrow, like I've said. But very importantly, the more that school have got a better understanding of what that bigger picture is and what you want and what your young person wants, that the more likely we are to get things right in the short term. And I'll talk sort of later on about exactly what the kind of methods are through which you can get that information across. But equally, make sure you do use those opportunities that I will talk about in a little minute, in a minute, to make sure that everybody in the setting understands what it is you want. And I think that's why that partnership working is so crucial. And again, when I talk later on about the different ways you've got, whether that's the EHCP review or whether it's parents' evening or whether it's the school reports, what I'm encouraging people to do is not to wait for that partnership only to take place at those interfaces, if you like, only at those points where the school are in the process of communicating with you. What I'm trying to get across is as in any relationship, to make sure that yes, you do use those opportunities, but that you're taking that proactive role in making sure school are provided with information, and not just providing information, but also asking questions. Because I bet there's plenty of opportunities, even outside of those normal ways that school have of communicating with you, where you will have questions, you'll not really be sure about something, and you think, oh well, school might have had a busy day, I don't want to contact them, etc., etc. And again, in my experience, the more that actually parents and carers do that, the more the school then has got the information they need. And one of the things I always do, and I know the head teachers I work with do this as well, is because they're contactable in whatever way works for them, which you should be able to ask them about, because they're contactable out of school hours, they would rather take a phone call, get an email at 8 o'clock at night about something that they can act on the next day. Or even if you're planning something for longer term, like I've talked about earlier in terms of longer term planning, they would rather they had that information at an earlier stage in order to make decisions, whether it is about the here and now or the tomorrow next week, or whether it is about longer term. So I think, again, where I'm flipping things on its head and trying to say, put yourself at the center of this as the expert, in terms of having that wealth of knowledge about the right thing to do for your child. Be proactive in terms of developing that partnership, and don't just think you have to wait for school to get in touch with you with the various pieces of information through the mechanisms that they've got, because it can be easy in schools. Schools are busy places, especially when you're dealing with young people with complex needs. It can be very easy for schools to think that if they're communicating with you in terms of the normal ways that they would to communicate, that like I said, the EHCP reviews, school reports, parents' evenings, fun days, whatever it might be, if they don't hear from you in the meantime for whatever reason, they will assume that as far as you're concerned, you're happy and that things are going well. And for that partnership to be truly effective, as I'll talk about in a little while, and as I've mentioned already, make sure that you're aware that you're an integral part of that partnership through the highs and the lows of your relationship with school. And please don't assume, just as professionals, that they contact you when they see fit, and don't assume that that's the only time that you should be having communication with them. And yes, they're busy, but yes, they need information. And for the young person's benefit, and from your point of view, make sure that you're integral to that partnership, and then there is a partnership, and then what you're not doing is just waiting and rely on the school providing you with information. And obviously, like I said, within that, the context of focusing on ultimate goal and what you want longer term for the young person is really important in terms of your communication with the school, to make sure the school understands the context you're working with. Because I think, I was talking to a head teacher yesterday, and actually, one or two of the issues that the parents have raised, when we sat down and looked at that and sort of started to talk about what we thought might be, the motivation for raising those points, it made everything make much more sense. And then I know when the head teacher had a conversation with the parent later on that day, it's changed the school perspective on what they're doing now. So I think that ultimately, always keep it the back of your mind, even when it's not necessarily about that longer term goal. When you're communicating with your child's school, when you're talking to the child's school, ultimately what you want and what the context is, and remind the school about that. Make sure the school understands about that, because they're busy, and sometimes in everything else that happens, they can kind of lose kind of focus on what that ultimate aim is. And if you think they're doing something that doesn't quite meet that, or doesn't quite make sense, ask the question. Make sense of what's happening now in terms of what you ultimately want in the longer term. And again, that is something that will help the school, in the sense that the school then can, if you like, make sense of the points you're raising in the light of what you want ultimately, rather than just focusing on the narrow here and now. And that's crucial to make sure that the schools stay focused on what the ultimate aim is, because otherwise they could end up going down a route which isn't the most beneficial for getting the best outcome for the child, and ultimately going back again to that child meeting their full potential. The more the school can stay focused on what the ultimate outcome is, the more likely they're going to be to get the outcome for the child, whether it's a particular course, whether it's a particular placement after school, the more that your child's then in a position to meet their potential. So there is really just going back there to the next part about your child. You are the expert, and this is, I really want to stress here, this is not about school abdicating and giving up responsibility and saying, you tell us. That isn't what this is about. What this is about is, the vast kind of depth of knowledge that you've got as the parent and carer that lives with that child at 24 hours a day. That amount, the amount of information you're holding, some of which you might think is not important for the school, which actually could be so crucial. And I think the only way that that's ever really going to get transmitted to the school, because obviously it's not all going to come at once, it does take time, is to make sure that you see your role at the center of this, and maintaining that effective relationship with the school, with the information flow as much as anything. And again, mechanisms that schools have got in the short term, the homeschool diaries that go home every day, etc., have to be matched with those with the more formal sort of EHCP reviews, like we've talked about, etc. But they're all school mechanisms. As I've said, the school mechanisms are there, but you have the ability to pick up your phone, to email, to talk to school whenever you want, even outside of those mechanisms. And I would encourage you to do that, because in many ways I've found that sometimes they're the best ways to actually get pieces of information that you need. And sometimes it's those informal channels of communication that we all know in any relationship. It's those informal ways of working when you're not necessarily sitting down formally and talking about things, that you really you tend to, or you really get to the crux sometimes of what the issues are, which then allows obviously the school to think, well, actually those are things that would never have come up at any HCP review. That might be a piece of information that you then get about something that would never have come across in the school report, about something that happens every day. Because having children myself, I know it's very difficult to get information from them about what's gone on in school. So again, just emphasizing with you at the core of this as the expert, don't be reliant on the school and just the formal mechanisms. The most beneficial things that could come out in terms for the school, particularly in terms of what to do, could come in those more informal kinds of conversations with you have. And equally, you could get information from school about what they do that would be useful for you in those more informal type of settings. And I think it is going to be a bumpy road. Apologies for the picture, I couldn't find a better one, but I think you get my point really, that as in any relationship there, particularly when you're dealing with professionals, and I've been a professional in this field for more years than I care to remember now, there is the danger that professionals, having done things a certain way for so long and being successful, think that they know best in that particular circumstance. But there's nothing wrong with you saying, actually, I don't think at this point in time, with that longer goal in mind that we talked about for my child, I don't think that at the moment in time this is the best thing to do, because, and I don't think you should have any concerns or fears about raising that with your school. And I do accept that at times people might say to me, well, I've done that previously, or I've not got the response I wanted, or a school might say to me, well, the parent didn't really raise it like that, they raised it in a way which didn't help me understand what the child needed. I think to accept that if we are really to stay or to get to this longer term goal, which is what we want for your child, to allow them to meet their potential, that relationship in the meantime at times could become a little bit bumpy. There could be difficulties in communication, but I'd encourage you not to give up on that and to maintain a relationship with that trusted person you've got in school, and to remember that whoever that is, class teacher, could be a teaching assistant, pastoral assistant, pastoral manager, there are various people in school you can go to where you feel you're not getting anywhere with that, and at times, we do recognize that for whatever reason, if the communication becomes an issue, that there are other people in the school that perhaps if they could take an overview of that situation with you, might mean that you actually get across what it is you want to get across at school. So I'd really, again, I can't emphasize enough that, as really what I would call the expert at the core of this, that to make sure that you do what you need to be listened to, because you have a right to be listened to, but particularly, it's you being listened to is going to make sure that your child is listened to. Because again, the chances are that the best person to understand the child, your child, and the best way that your child's going to get their voice across, despite what school might try to do, is via you. So don't be concerned that at times, if things feel like you feel you're not getting things across that you need to get across, and things are getting a bit difficult, don't be concerned about speaking to the school about that. Whoever it is you need to speak to, even if you need to speak to someone different in the school, because without that relationship, it's not going to be effective for the young person. And anybody looking at it outside of whoever it is you've been speaking to is going to recognize that if they think then we're not going to get what we need for your child in the long term. So again, I've already started to talk about this really there. What I'm talking about that in terms of what you can expect from us is you should and you have a right to expect that effective communication back from the school. I could well have people listening today, and it's very easy for me to say, isn't it, that at the heart of this, you need to communicate with school, as I've said, about the longer term goal for your child in terms of short term decisions, and to do that outside of the normal mechanisms of communication that school might have. But actually, the school then have a responsibility to make sure they communicate effectively with you. And in my experience, where you've got parents and carers who are proactive about their communication flow, schools generally do appreciate that. And you know, it's not about, is it, and let's be clear, it's not about bombarding them, and you know that, with you know, requests where, you know, you're concerned that you're doing it all the time, etc., etc. You know, if you feel like it's getting to that point where you feel like all you're doing is having to communicate and at the home school book, or you're having to ring, and you know, that's an issue to raise yourself, because really you shouldn't be in a position where you're feeling that you're becoming a burden, or you're having to communicate so much. In many ways, that's an issue in itself, isn't it? So I think that, you know, from the school, you should expect that effective communication back, that effective communication about what you're asking or what you're trying to get across. And if you don't feel you're getting that, to raise that with the school, to raise it with a different person in the school. And let's be honest, don't be afraid, if you need to go to senior members of staff, to go to the head teacher, if you feel for whatever reason in that particular circumstance the communication is not effective. Because ultimately, you know, sometimes a head teacher might not necessarily be aware that early on if communication isn't being effective. And what we don't want is, we don't want a time lag where you've then got a period of time where things are not working in the best way that you think they should be working for your child, because ultimately the heart of that is the young person who's not having the needs met. And that's not what we would want to happen, you know, because like I said, it's not going to take very long if things go off track, where we lose sight about what the ultimate long-term goal is and what the outcomes are for the young person. And it could take a long time then to get things back on track if we're not doing the right things. And if you feel it, you know, from the voice of your young person, that things are not being done in a way which is the best for them in terms of meeting their immediate needs and longer term outcomes, and they're communicating that with you, you should expect, when you then communicate that with school, to get effective communication back, and not to feel unsure or afraid to raise the fact that you're not being communicated with effectively, or to raise the fact that, you know, I want to get in touch with you every day. There's an issue every day. We've got a bigger term issue here. We need a longer term issue, a bigger issue we need to look at, that we need to address, because, you know, people are busy, people have got other children, they've got other jobs. The schools are busy as well, and you know, they want to be able to do it in the best way that works for that young person. And so the more you can tell them where you think it's not being effective, the more then they're in they've got the opportunity early on to address what the issue is as to why the communication isn't being effective. And in that as well, obviously, you know, you can expect that level of honesty from the school. And I say that in a sense of, people say, well, what do you mean the school have to, you know, I expect the school to be honest with me. And I think it's about saying where you feel, for whatever reason, that you're not being communicated in a way that you feel reflects what you're seeing. So it's not, my point here is, and very much this is along the lines of a conversation I had with a parent yesterday, is it wasn't that the parent didn't feel that the school was being honest, but it just felt that the way the school was used to communicating with parents and carers about this particular issue, that the school the parent didn't feel that they were getting the true picture. It wasn't that the school weren't trying to be honest, but it was obviously the way the school felt they would be honest and were being straight about a particular issue, because that's how they talk about it, wasn't what the parent needed. And as a result, the parent wasn't clear then, or didn't understand to an extent exactly what the school were trying to say. So of course you should expect honesty from the school and clarity about the particular situation. And if you don't feel that the way the school are trying to get across to you what's happened is getting across a true picture, to raise that with them. And in doing so, you know, what I've put there is that school should be there and listening to you, that they should listen to what you're trying to say. And all of the things I've said today, obviously that assumes that you've got a setting and a group of staff who are prepared to listen and prepared to talk and prepared to have that relationship. And you should expect from that setting, you should expect the setting to be clear with you about what's going on in the short term and longer term. You should expect them to be listening to you. And where you do, you know, where you do feel, and in doing so there still is a difference of opinion, they should still listen to that as well. So you should be able to explain why, and to really feel empowered to discuss that with them. You know, some of the most productive conversations I've had, even as, you know, when I've worked as a head teacher within the Witherslack group, and in my previous settings in some larger, you know, and particularly in a large school for young people with complex needs, you know, a lot of occasions would just be about listening to what people had to say. In terms of, you know, other staff might have got confused and thought the parent was gonna raise an issue or make a complaint. And sometimes it's about listening to get to the bottom of a situation, and you should expect that from the school. And where you feel that it's not happening, you should expect that, you know, an opportunity to make that point with whoever it is in school that's going to be able to help you solve that shorter term issue, because ultimately, again, that's going to be the most productive thing for making sure the school stay focused on what the long-term goal is for your young person and what that ultimate outcome, the outcome will be for the young person. And I think that one of the things I've talked about today is where you've got the more formal processes for communicating is to make sure that you do use those then when other professionals are involved to review how that relationship is. And don't be afraid to say in those more formal settings, because sometimes, you know, there is a formal agenda, but don't be afraid to raise that relationship about effective working with the school in terms of managing the needs of the young person. Because, you know, going back to what I said about young people coming home and talking about what's happening in school in the day, you know, with the kind of complex needs we're dealing with when we're working with young people with ADHD, or whether we're working with young people with whatever level of need that they've got, you know, if we are ultimately going to create that kind of environment, which is a positive environment for them to meet their potential, the onus lies on us as the adults and the professionals to make sure that we constantly look back at the way that we're working together. And, you know, encouraging you to walk into a more formal review setting, such as the EHCP review, which should be about reviewing that relationship, not just about the more formal things that have to be reviewed, if you like, in the EHCP review. You know, that is the opportunity really to say, with all this said and done, however well it's going, I would like moving forward to work in a different way, or to continue working the way that we are, that we are, because ultimately, you know, unless you do that in that setting, all of the professionals around that table are not necessarily going to be aware. And, you know, there are other professionals who can work with the school to support that relationship, if at that point it's felt necessary. So don't assume that, you know, you can't, in the more formal context as well, talk very specifically about that relationship with the school, because crucially, if you don't, it means that perhaps other people are not going to be aware of that, and some of those other people around the table are potentially the other people that could support you with some of the issues that you've raised with the school. And I guess, you know, how can you help us? We've talked about this, sharing information, just looking back, you know, in terms of summarizing what we talked about today, with you at the core of this, with you as the expert. There's things that you'll know that we won't know. As I said, you look after young person 24 hours a day. Let us know. Let us know sooner rather than later. Like I've said, you know, talk to your school and make sure you're clear. And, you know, if they've not made you clear, talk to them about the best way for sharing different types of information as and when, you know, about things that you need to share daily. Hopefully they've got homeschool diaries, you've got communication methods that are in place. You know, some of the secondary schools, if you like, for older young people are not necessarily going to have the homeschool diaries, but make sure you're clear about the different ways that the school have got for you to share information, so you can do it in the right way. In other words, that you can make sure that you get what you need quickly by using the mechanism that school have got. So whether it's the short-term ways, like I've said, about homeschool diaries, telephone calls from TAs or members of staff, to the more longer-term ways coming around to the HCP review, there's always opportunities for you to share information that the school can best use to make sure they're doing the right thing on a constant basis for the young person. And obviously, to make sure that when you're talking to the school about good behaviour and about attendance, that if there's anything the school think you can do and vice versa, that you have those conversations. Because interestingly, that, you know, I would never argue that, you know, the processes and the systems that have in school necessary for behaviour and getting things right for the young person are easily easily transferable to the home, if you like. But I think there are things going on in school at home that both the homes and school could learn from, as in there's a way of working, or, you know, we don't want to repeat what we do in school at home because you'll say to us that won't work, but actually that point system or rewards, we've got something at home where we use this particular thing so school could use. I think there's an overlap here. I think there's an overlap that gets forgotten about, that, again, going back to that sharing of information, that communication, that both the home and school could benefit from for the young person. So don't be afraid to do that. Don't be afraid to assume that things at school do won't necessarily work from home, and don't be afraid to assume the things that work from home schools wouldn't want to adapt and adopt in that setting. Because ultimately, in doing that, if we can get it right, the ultimate goal of the young person being in school, and that's why I've put attendance there in terms of meeting their needs, particularly in the short term, to get to that long-term goal. The more we can do that, the more this young person is going to have a successful experience at school. So I don't think we should assume that just because one thing works at home and one thing works at school, some of the principles can't be shared and some of the ideas can't be shared, because in my experience, that can actually be very productive. And I think ultimately what we put there is, you know, what I wanted to say here is about, in order to do that, let's make sure that we're all an open book. This is as much to professionals as to parents and carers. Is the more that, you know, that relationship is managed on the basis that we want an open book. We want to talk about the good and the bad and the indifferent, whether it's a rocky road at times or not. The more that we can do that, ultimately, as again with any relationship, the more we're in a position to create that positive environment, because we get everything out there. We deal with it, we put the right things in place, and we move on. We don't allow anything to rumble. We don't not raise it. We don't think it will be okay. We raise it, we talk about it. Sometimes we need to talk more than at other times. That's okay as well. But over the longer term, what that means is there's a transparency and openness to the relationship that means we're all doing the right thing and moving in the right direction for the young person. There you go, tell us. If that's a mantra today, it's tell us, isn't it? Make sure we know, make sure professionals we know, but equally, let's not forget that equal responsibility, like I said, about the school to make sure they tell you. And it's about making sure that relationship is equal, the information flow is equal. Yes, we're all an open book, but that we've got an equal information flow, and we're not afraid to ask each other questions about what's going on, either at home or in school, to make sure we can get the right things in place. As much as anything, I'm quite happy that covers some of the principles I've talked about without going into sort of specific details of you know, a toolkit, if you like, of things that people can do. So I'm happy to open things out now. If anybody's got any questions, to hand back to Claire to see if there's anything that's come through yet, Claire, or if we get anything now, if we wait a few minutes for people to ask, that perhaps I can either elaborate on, or if people have got any specific problems or issues that they wanted to raise, that I could give them any pointers with.
Yeah, Chris, we have had a couple that have come in, so we'll get cracking with that. We probably aim to have sort of 10 minutes or so on the Q&A session now. So yeah, if anyone else has got any questions they want to send through, that's great. But I've got a couple here that we'll get started with, if that's okay. So to start with, my 19-year-old is returning to education, and we are encouraging them to seek support at college, but the young person doesn't like to make a fuss. So what would your thoughts be on this, and how can we help them get the support needed?
I think it's understanding who that young person would feel comfortable talking to, because there'll be someone who the young person is comfortable talking to, whether that's at the home initially or in the setting, that it can be spoken to. So if it's in the setting, for example, the parent or carer could speak to that member of staff and explain it, because there could be that member of staff's got a way of working with them that means that they can get that information out of them. Equally, if the young person's not at the moment prepared to talk to anybody themselves, to find out the best way the young person would like to raise those issues. Now, I guess if it's difficult, if the young person can't articulate that, but I think it's about that trusted person at home or at school that can, in the first instance, have the conversation, or the young person can quite happily go and talk to. That person then can obviously make sure they try and do things in the way that the young person is comfortable with. So I'd say the key to this, Claire, for that person who's asked that, would be to put the young person at the heart of this, to find out who they're prepared to talk to, but also, as important, to find out the way they're prepared for it to come out, if you like. and so it doesn't look like they're making a fuss. You know, things can be done in a way which don't make the young person feel it's making a fuss, but to put them at the heart of it would be the key for me.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And we'll move on to the next one now. So this one is a bit of a, I suppose you'll be answering in your opinion with this one, I guess. So do you think that too much responsibility is put on SENCOs within mainstream schools rather than all teachers having training and awareness around disabilities and the impact that they can have on a child's behaviour and learning?
Yeah, I think it's everyone's responsibility, but I suppose I understand in busy schools and settings the pressures in so many ways on staff. I think what that's about, that for me is what I would call a structural problem for the school, to make sure that to whatever degree, whether it's because there's a young person in a particular class or there's a group of young people, that across the staff team there are ways of making sure that that information and responsibility is relayed. Because as much as you might get a teacher who thinks, well, I'm not the SENCO, I'm not the SEN expert, I bet any money if you could give that teacher something for better working with a young person or group of young people, they'd want the information. So I think it's not about saying to people now, you know, as in you've got responsibility as the main person in the school for young people with special needs. It's accepting it's everyone's responsibility to meet the needs of the young people in their settings. And where there are things that that teacher or member of staff thinks above and beyond what they're able to do, there should be a mechanism in school. There should be something in school that allows that teacher to access that support or resource or whatever it is to work with that young person. So I think it's about making them understand a bit like I've talked about previously when I've done, you know, when we've done virtual conferences and I've talked to SENCOs, is about making sure that the staff understand that in the end it's because it's for the young person's benefit. The more staff can understand, the better. So that's really about I mean, I think one of the things I said in the SENCO presentation was about SENCOs going to talk to the SLT, whoever's got ultimate senior management responsibility, to look at the structures in place in the school for communicating with staff. They need to exist, otherwise the staff are going to really struggle to implement perhaps some of the things they need to put in place. So it's about SENCOs being brave there and saying to the SLT, this is a crucial role, but other staff need to work on this with me because it's everybody's responsibility.
Okay, thanks, Chris. We've got quite a lot coming in now, quite a lot of questions. So as I say, we'll probably do another 5 minutes or so, and we'll just try and get through as many as we possibly can. So let me read the next one out to you. So we've been through some difficult transitions with different schools, which has really affected my child's confidence, and they refuse to attend quite a lot now. Which seems to further disrupt the relationships with school. Any advice on how we can gently get him back to a more positive place when it comes to school?
I think the key to that, if you've got a young person who's because of changes and perhaps less successful, it's had less successful periods in schools because for whatever reason the school, you know, couldn't meet their needs in the right way, or you know, whatever that might be. Again, whatever position that young person is in now, it's finding that trusted person in the setting, because I think sometimes people make the mistake, going back to what the person asked previously about, you know, whose responsibility is it. In a way, it kind of doesn't matter who it is in that building in the first instance. Some can support that young person back to school. You know, I would argue that if you look in some of our settings, there are staff with roles and responsibilities that are outside of what goes on in the classroom, but at times they've played a role in that young person being in school. And I really do mean everything from school cooks to site supervisors. So I think it's to look at who that young person would feel comfortable with and talking to that person in the setting, because, you know, whatever the school does or doesn't put in place, if the school isn't aware of who the best person would be to do it, it's never going to work. And, you know, there'll normally be someone the young person is prepared to work with, and it might be that only that person for a period of time, but it's about finding out from that young person, getting their voice and seeing who it is they would be prepared to work with to look at how they get back into school. Because what that means, Claire, is that means then the young person can design and be an integral part of looking what that program reintegration looks like.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, I'll try and squeeze in another couple more if that's okay.
Yeah,
So My daughter is 10 and is struggling at the minute with her emotions. We are asking school to help with maybe a mental health team or CAMS, as she gets very frustrated with herself and can become physical with herself. Any ideas or advice here?
Yeah, I think there's a number of avenues you've got there. I mean, if you genuinely think at the moment that a mental health support would be beneficial, you've actually got an option outside of school via your GP, which I found to be far more quicker at accessing the quite right level of support. Because one of the issues is, I don't know if people are aware that you know, if schools are referring and trying to communicate with, especially when it's a new referral, it's a very difficult process in terms of, or compared to the parent or carer taking the young person to the GP. Now, I appreciate that's difficult because that means a conversation with GP and the young person might not want to get involved. But I think if the school don't already have what I would call a relationship with CAMS or young people involved with CAMS, to ask the school if they do or not, and to ask their advice about taking an avenue outside of school, which could be quicker. So don't think it has to be just about going via the school. And obviously, even if you do go via the GP and get CAMS involvement, CAMS will then communicate with the school once you know the young person's got some kind of CAMS involvement. So I would argue to talk to the school to see if they think they've got any avenues to CAMS, and if they don't, that you can actually put that in place, or at least talk to your GP about it to move things along.
That's great, Chris. Thank you very much for that. So I hope I'm going to read this next question out. Okay, so my child is in Key Stage 1 and he is autistic. What can I do to help him when he comes home from school to avoid like meltdowns and things like that?
This sounds to me, without knowing the specifics, I think if we talk broadly about transition, I think what I would do in that position is I would almost want a knowledge of the things that go on throughout each school day for him to work with. Now, if he doesn't already have what I'd call a visual timetable of school, to ask the school if that can be done, or you can go online and look for that yourself. Because what I'd say the school could be doing is that visual timetable doesn't just have to be restricted to the school day. In other words, what the school could do is to prepare him for that transition before he leaves school, in a way that we would all prepare children, you know, before they go to school. We get things ready with them and you go through that process. I think if you know what the school are doing during the day, rather than having that kind of drop off then from him leaving school and then coming straight home, which obviously the two very different environments, if he's struggling to deal with that, to look at what the school could do to support you with that bridge. So going back to what I talked about in the presentation about communication, if school don't already know that he's got an issue when he comes home, I think if they know that, I think they could work with you on that transition into whatever way works to start to prepare him for that journey, and then the transition to when he gets back home in the evening. And I think that's something they could quite easily do, because it could be as simple as a conversation. It could be as a reminder to show him what he's going to be doing that evening. So if you've not already spoken to the school, I think I'd let them know there's this issue, and to see what they think about supporting you and your child with that transition on a daily basis.
Okay, that was some great advice there, Chris. So I'll move on to our final question now. Okay. So this question has come in from somebody who's responsible for a forum, like a parents network. And the aim of the forum is to develop parent groups that are independent from the school.
Yeah.
Parents believe this is very important to get their voices heard.
Yeah.
You know, as a group can have more impact. However, schools can sometimes be really reluctant to collaborate with parents in this way. Do you have any advice here?
Yeah, I think it's good. I mean, I think in practically every setting I've gone into, and in some settings I've even set up a parents forum that who would meet outside of meetings with me, if you like, and I've encouraged them to do that. I think if the school can understand and have it explained to them that it's with a spirit of openness and to have a forum for a voice, An example being that in a school I've worked in for Witherslack, for example, there was parents who organised a Facebook group for general communication. And I spoke to them about that, and we spoke, and it was actually really useful, because what they did as well is they explained to the parents and to the school, you know, everybody's responsibility in managing it, so that yes, it was an open forum. The school didn't have access to it, so I didn't know what was talked about. And we had an agreement that the two people who'd organised it wouldn't be spokespeople, if you like, but if there were any particular issues that were going on from time to time, they would contact me. And if there were bigger issues developing, that they would organise meetings and sort of you know, Teams meetings, webcam meetings during COVID anyway, where we could talk about particular issues. I think the key to it is to make sure the school understand that it's there to aid and support the parents, and then if then the school can start to see that in fruition as a way of working, you know, I can't see why they would have a problem with that if it's used in the right way, because, you know, you have to accept, again, go back to what we talked about in terms of relationships, and schools need to accept, don't they? That, you know, it's not always going to be information that you necessarily is going to be the brightest thing to happen to you that day, because sometimes things don't work, sometimes things are not great, sometimes things go wrong. And I think if the parents and carers know they've got an avenue, which, if you like, they can have a conversation, as long as there's an agreed way of communicating that with the school in the right way. You know, if that can be explained to the school from the start, I think the schools are more likely to engage with it. Again, it's just gone back to what I've said in the presentation about being an open book and being honest, and managing it in the right way. I really can't see why it would be an issue if that's how it's looked after.
That was brilliant, Chris. Thanks ever so much. And so that just about brings us to the end of Chris's presentation this morning.